This particular conference is going to be on the value of monastic life. I know this sounds a little bit strange to be giving this type of a conference to you, because none of you are nuns and none of you are monks. But in order to understand what is the value of the convent of the Immaculate Conception, which we have Mass in every morning, accompanied together with the words of the Blessed Virgin Mary about that convent and about the monastic life, it is certainly something that it's something important for our children, but it's something important for us also, because we have to have this degree of appreciation for the religious life. We can't pass over what the religious life is. If we pass over the religious life, we're not going to really see how important, for example, Mariana of Jesus is in the eyes of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we're not going to understand the value of her offering. The next conference I give is going to be on the connection between suffering and charity, and we'll look at the different degrees of suffering and what it is that can be offered up. But that last degree is victim. The last degree is victim, which Mariana did. She offered herself as a victim for the church of our time. It's a very important thing. There are questions that could be thrown out there. For example, where did the graces for Archbishop Lefebvre come from? Or where did the graces for you to be here, where did they come from? Or where do the graces come for you to convert to the faith, or to get out of a lapsed state if you were in one? Or where did the graces come from for the perseverance of the faith in this time, that anyone has it in this time? What is the involvement that woman had with the work of preserving the church in this time? It seems perhaps ridiculous to some. Oh, well, she's just some woman in a convent. Whoop-de-doo. There's not any consequence there. How significant could one person actually be? And that's the reason why it is important to look at the value of monastic life and what it is. So I have some quotations here. With the fabrication of my image, so this is the Blessed Virgin Mary talking to Mariana about the statue that you see above the main altar. With the fabrication of that statue, not only you or my monastery do I look upon with favor, but also upon the nation and all the people in general through the centuries. That's us. This my monastery, being a support, will be salvation for many souls, because I will draw them out of the abyss of sins in which they find themselves. God will be glorified in them. How many secret conversions there will be. Oh, that's wonderful, Father. People will convert. What does it really mean? It's not simply highlighting the importance of the Blessed Virgin Mary for the life of the church. It highlights a certain predilection for this monastery. It highlights a certain need for the religious life for the life of the church. And Mary makes herself a religious to emphasize this point. But it also emphasizes the need of the religious life in this time, seeing it as a solution to the crisis that she describes. You cannot read through the book, The Admirable Life of Mariana of Jesus, and not be impressed by the fact that the religious vocation is emphasized so strongly as a remedy for crisis. And one of the reasons why we're still in crisis is because the religious life is still in crisis. Another quotation. And Father Baquerizo mentioned this quotation. I was happy to see that he did a little bit of his homework. He mentioned this quotation in one of the talks that he gave at the churches in the morning procession. "Woe to the world if there were no monasteries or convents. Mortals do not understand their worth. For if they understood, they would spend their assets in multiplying them, because in these are found the remedy for all physical and moral evils. No one on the face of the earth realizes whence comes the salvation of souls, the conversion of sinners, the dissipation of great scourges, the production and fertility of the fields, the end of pestilences and wars, and the good harmony among nations. All this comes from the prayers that rise from the monasteries and convents." It's a very strong quotation. Another quotation, this one is, I actually used this for a newsletter for the Third Order that I put together. It's a quotation from Dom Chautard in his book, The Soul of the Apostolate. And in this book, Dom Chautard, the author, he is emphasizing the importance of the contemplative aspect within those who are involved in active apostolate. So if we're involved in active apostolate, we need to be putting gas in the tank. Otherwise, it's going to run out and we're going to burn out. And so he stresses that he emphasizes the need for the contemplative aspect in the apostolic active worker. So, for example, the Society of St. Pius X. We are not contemplatives. We are more defined as a kind of missionary congregation in a way, trying to reconvert the land or bring back the traditions amongst groups of people, pockets of faithful here and there that are asking us to come for them. And so we are called to go out, and we're called to give conferences, and we're called to give retreats and found schools and teaching classes, and all this is very active work. And in order to prevent us from burning out, we have to have a contemplative aspect. That was the wisdom of Archbishop Lefebvre when he set the rule for the members of the Society of St. Pius X that we would have in the morning our divine office, the office of prime, and then 25 minutes of silent prayer. The contemplative aspect to keep the gas in the tank. And priests that burn out, it's always because they lost that. Always. Every single case I know, it's because they lost that. So Dom Chautard. No one in this world knows the reason for the conversion of pagans at the very ends of the earth, for the heroic endurance of Christians under persecution, for the heavenly joy of martyred missionaries. All this is bound up with the prayer of some humble, cloistered nun. Her fingers play the keyboard of divine forgiveness and of the eternal lights. Her silent and lonely soul presides over the salvation of souls and the conquests of the church. Almost poetic what he said there, the fingers of this lowly nun playing the keyboard of divine forgiveness and presiding over the conquests of the church. So the religious life is important. Why is it so precious, the religious life? It's because the religious life, if lived as it's supposed to be, is a state of perfection. I remember in some seminary years reading books of Dom Marmion or Garrigou-Lagrange talking about what is the degree of the perfection of a bishop versus a priest versus a monk, and making all kinds of comparisons, talking about the different states, the states of perfection. If thou wouldst be perfect, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. As such, the religious life is so precious because of the proximity to God. It is the greatest. And the imitation of Christ is also the greatest. We'll have to analyze those two statements, the proximity to God and the imitation of Christ. Those who really live the religious life, they enter into a state that involves a greater proximity to God. Their life is one focused solely on God. Their life is one of continual prayer. Their life is one of sacrifices and offering. It is saturated with the things of God and the language of God. Their life is one of the sacraments. It is one that is focused on the development of the virtues and in a most detailed way, a fine degree of attention. And their life is one that is consumed with the fire of the love of God, and it is dominated by the action of the Holy Ghost. All of that equals proximity to God. And how does all this happen? It leads us into the second point there, the imitation of Christ. It is because their imitation of Christ through the Evangelical Counsels. These are the counsels or the advices that Christ recommends in the gospel. We say it was the life that Christ himself led. Come and follow me, he said. Live like me. Do what I do. Give up what I don't have, what I don't need. Saying that, give up what I don't have and what I don't need. There are some that look at the religious life as a renunciation. I don't have these things. But of course, the religious, they look at the life differently. They look at it like, I can give these things. We know them as the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those are the Evangelical Counsels. Some orders have made other vows. You heard, for example, Father Duverger this morning say St. Peter Nolaskai, he inserted a fourth vow, which was to give oneself up in exchange if that was required. So if I'm a Mercedarian and I see that the Muslims are holding this Christian captive, he made a vow that he would offer himself in exchange to free that person, which it did happen. So the three vows, though, poverty, chastity, and obedience. And entering a life of these is entering into a state of perfection. Why? Because it's ultimate freedom. It is ultimate freedom. I have to say a little word on that to explain what freedom is. St. Paul uses that expression, the freedom of the sons of God. Freedom is the rest or the repose of the soul, specifically the will, in the good. That's why there's no question of, I'm free to do evil. That's not freedom. You may call it choice. You may call it a bad choice. You may call it an abuse of your will, the faculty for discerning or for choosing. Not discerning, for deciding or choosing. But it's not freedom. Freedom is connected with the good. And for those who rest in the good, they are the ones that are truly free. This can only happen, this rest of the soul in the good, it can only happen with the ransom made by Christ in which the soul is able to possess God, being a son of God, or the freedom of the sons of God. And this is why sin is understood as a slavery. Another remark that Father Duverger made this morning in his talk, the slavery of sin. Not in some pious sense, but in a real way. Sin impedes the will to possess the good. And if the will does not possess the good, the person is not good, and they are not free. Instead, they are enchained in the links of sin, the bonds of sin. Now, with the vows, there is a systematic approach and an engagement that is made. That's what the vow is. A vow is a solemn promise made to God. And it is an act of religion, just like we understand that oaths are an act of religion. When we solemnly swear to tell the truth, and then we perjure, it is an act against religion. And for one who makes a vow, I have a private vow of celibacy. If I violate that and I committed some impurity, then I have the sin, which is the impurity, but also the sin against my act of religion, which is the vow. And the vow is this systematic approach. When one enters into these vows, they are entering into a program to make themselves perfect. And that's one of the reasons why third orders have always existed, since the Middle Ages, because people have understood that those people are being sanctified by that life. I'm a layperson, but I want something of what they have because it sanctifies. It's a state of perfection. So the vows are a systematic approach, an engagement made into a life which overcomes sin. And not only overcomes sin, but even the roots of sin. So with the vow of poverty, one relinquishes ownership of anything. It is a way of breaking any attachment to things. We could say that the vow of poverty is the perfection of the spirit of the 10th commandment, which regulates our attachment to things. And not only ownership, but even the responsibility of dispensing of goods. The other day we went out to be measured for some new cassocks. And someone said to the brother, would you like to come out also? You look like you could use a new cassock. In fact, they always look like they could use a new cassock. And the brother said, no. And the person, why, what's wrong? And I had to say, look, he's got a vow of poverty. He can't make that decision. Someone else makes it for him. Oh, well, then you do that, Father. No, I'm not his superior. I cannot make that decision for him. He has no right to do it. Wow. I remember another instance. I think I've used this one before. I find it a little humorous. I was at the seminary, and I knocked on one of the brothers' doors, and he had this nice little statue. It was very tasteful, something that a lot of people don't have, but he had it. It was very tasteful. It's like, wow, brother, that's a really nice little statue you got there. And he said, do you want it? Like he was ready to have no ownership of it. He understood, well, it's not mine, actually. That's public goods. It's property of the house. St. John saw this as a root of corruption and sin for Judas. It was not because he cared about the poor, but it was because he carried the purse, and he was a thief. Why wasn't this money given to the poor? Instead, she bought some precious ointment to anoint you. This should have been sold and the money given to the poor. And St. John says it wasn't because he cared for the poor. It's because he was attached and he was a thief. And that's a root of corruption. And that's the reason why there's a 10th commandment. Because God Almighty knows all too well that we are dominated by an insatiable craving for creatures. With chastity, one relinquishes the life of the responsibility of a family. This includes children and spouse. St. Paul in his epistle to the Corinthians, the unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy in body and spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And so with chastity, to relinquish those things is to put yourself in a position in which you are free from that. And why? Because now I can be filled with God all the time. I don't have to think about my bratty children or my whining children. I don't have to think about my nagging wife or my insensitive husband. I can just focus on the things of God. It also refers to the delights of the flesh, the concupiscence that arises in the soul, and the vow becomes a systematic way of being free of these. And as an act of religion, it's not just a commitment that I will avoid those things, but because it's an act of religion, it becomes a cause of grace to remain faithful in that relinquishing. And as I said, it's not just a relinquishing. The religious always understands his vows as, look at all you. You can't give what I can give. You can't. But I can. That's what a religious says. I can give so much more because I don't have what you have. I am free of those things. I can soar like the eagle in the heavens, but you cannot because you're chained to the earth. And then obedience. The relinquishing of one's own will. This is a hard one. Some people think, they say to the priest, you can't get married? I'm like, trust me. You can't get married? And then I say back, something like, well, and you can't soar to the heavens like I can. But they think that the chastity one is the most difficult one. Obedience is probably the most difficult one. Obedience. The relinquishing one's own will, or better said, the movement to continually align one's own will to that of another. It's not even to look for a distinction. When the will of the superior is manifest or even suspect. Believe it or not, a religious can be accused of disobedience because he did not discern what should have been easily discernible. Well, we think, my superior didn't say it. The subordinate, the one in obedience, can't think that way. The one in obedience has to think, I really suspect in the strongest way that this is what he would say. He can't go back and say, he didn't say it. He would still be accused of disobedience even if he didn't say it, because he knew what the superior's will was. And he has the job of aligning his will with that of his superior. And that's an interior movement. It's tremendously hard to do. So we look at sin. Aversio a Deo, turning away from God. Conversio ad creaturam, the turning towards a creature. Turning away from God, turning towards a creature. Now this turning towards a creature, the conversio is the turning of the will towards the creature, and particularly the most common, which is the delights of the flesh, and therefore you have the program to counteract sin. The program in the will, which is the obedience, towards the creature, which is the poverty, towards the delights of the flesh, which is the chastity. It's a program to overcome sin. It's a program to soar to God, being free to do so. It's the ultimate freedom for those who live that life, for those who strive in that life. Trust me, they don't always feel like it's the ultimate freedom. But nonetheless, it is the state and the program to overcome sin. Engage in this program via vow, which is an act of religion and an act of offering. It's the highest act of offering that can be made. The highest act of offering. And that is the truest freedom. It's the highest rest and repose in good, and therefore God Himself. And it's the reason why Jesus Christ loves the religious so much. And it's the reason why the life of the religious for the life of the church is so important. The world needs these souls to avert the wrath of God. You've heard that expression before, that the world, it would be easier for the sun, or it'd be easier for the earth to survive without the sun than without the Mass. There could be a parallel, or maybe slightly less, observation with the life of the religious. How necessary it is for the life, for the church to survive because of these souls. These are the favored souls of God. You think about the consecrated virgins that follow the Lamb wherever He goes. These are the ones that are closest. These are the ones that when they pray to Jesus, they are more effective. As priests, we know that. We always say that God doesn't really answer our prayers because we're like brothers. And He's like, He'll give us a slap or something. But, when we say, I know a good idea. I'm going to call the sisters. When He sees them, He sees these chosen souls. He sees these consecrated virgins that remind Him of His own mother. That's the way to get it done. And it's true. So the world needs these souls. We need these souls. And that is the importance of the convents and the monasteries, the importance of the religious life. And as we continue our progression towards the conference on the life of Mariana of Jesus, that is the importance of her vocation, and particularly for the time in which we live. This talk is really on the connection between suffering and charity. So we look at suffering first. Suffering is something that is necessary. Most spiritual writers will assert this. I think all spiritual writers would assert it, that suffering is necessary for our salvation, at least in some degree. Firstly, to make amends for our own sins, and then secondly, for the sanctification of our soul.